Ruth was simply ecstatic in her enjoyment and ran to our host wife in the full ardor of her new experience. The latter, who fully appreciated her young friend's feelings, was just as enthusiastic. Although it was no novelty in the sense of a first experience, she said she could never cease to marvel, however familiar she should become with her ship home, at the glorious dispensation that provided such beauties and pleasures for the dwellers in spirit lands. We had by now approached sufficiently near to the island to be able to view it quite well, and the boat turned in her course and followed the coastline. After continuing along in this fashion for a little while, we sailed into a small bay which formed a picturesque natural harbor. The island certainly came up to our expectations in its scenic beauty. There were not many dwellings upon it. Those that were to be seen were more summer houses than anything else. But the great feature of the place was the number of trees, none of them very tall, but all were of particularly vigorous growth. And in the branches we could see scores of the most wonderful birds, whose plumage presented a riot of color. Some of the birds were flying about, others, the larger variety, were walking majestically along the ground. But all of them were unafraid of us. They walked with us as we strolled along, and when we held up our hands, some small bird would be sure to perch upon our fingers. They seemed to know us, to know that any harm coming to them was an utter impossibility. They did not require to make a constant search for food, nor exercise a perpetual vigilance against what on earth would be their natural enemies. They were, like ourselves, part of the external world of spirit, enjoying in their way, as we do in ours, their eternal life. Their very existence was just another of those thousands of things that are given to us for our delight. The birds which had the most gorgeous plumage were evidently of the kind that live in the tropical parts of the earth plane, and which are never seen by the eye of man until he comes to the spirit world. By the perfect adjustment of temperature, they were able to live in comfort with those of less spectacular appearance. And all the while they were singing and twittering in a symphonious sound. It was never wearying, in spite of the quantity of sound that was going on, because in some extraordinary fashion the musical sounds blended with each other. Neither were they piercing in quality, despite the fact that many of the small birds' songs were themselves high-pitched. But it was their trusting friendliness that was so delightful by comparison with the earthly birds, whose life there takes them into another world almost. Here we were part of the same free world, and the understanding between the birds and ourselves was reciprocal. When we spoke to them, we felt that they knew just what we were saying, and in some subtle way we seemed to know just what their thoughts were. To call to any particular bird meant that that bird understood, and it came to us. Our friends, of course, had encountered all of this before, but to Ruth and me, it was a new and very wonderful experience. And the thought came to me that had I really considered the matter, and perhaps used my mind a little more, I might have known what we should eventually see, that we should eventually see something of this sort. For why, I asked myself, should the great Father of Heaven create all the beautiful birds solely for the earth plane, and make them to live in places that are frequently quite inaccessible to men, where he can never see them and enjoy them? And even those that he can see and enjoy, are they to perish forever? Would the far greater world of spirit be denied the beautiful things that are given to the earth world? Here was the answer before and around us. It is the conceit and self-importance of man that he should think that beauty is expressly created for his pleasure while on earth. Incarnate man thinks he has the monopoly of beauty. When he becomes discarnate, he eventually wakes up to the fact that he has never really seen how great beauty can be, and he becomes silent and humble perhaps for the first time in his life. It is a salutary lesson, the awakening in spirit. Believe me, my dear friend, what with many a shock to accompany it. The perfect blaze of color from all the birds we could see about us was almost too much for us to take in one visit. They were beyond description, and I shall not even attempt it. We strolled on through delightful groves, past the musical murmurings of the many brooks, through glades of velvet grass, as in an absolute fairyland of nature. We met people on the way who called a greeting to us or waved their hands. They were all happy among the birds. We were told that this part of the island was exclusive to the birds and that no other form of animal life intruded upon them. Not that there was any fear or danger that they would come to harm, because that would be impossible, but because the birds were happier with their own kind. We eventually returned to the boat and put to sea again. We were interested to discover whence our host had acquired his floating home. Such an intricate piece of building would require experts, most surely, to plan it and others to build it. He told us that a boat was involved under precisely the same conditions as our spirit houses or any other building. A prerequisite is that we must earn the right to possess it, that we understand. What, then, of the many people in spirit who on earth designed and built boats of every description, either as a means of livelihood or as a form of recreation? Would the latter particularly abandon such pleasures when they could continue in their handicraft? Here they have the means and the motive to carry on with their task, whether it be for work or for pleasure. And it can be said that though many build their boats for the pleasure of doing so, yet they give great pleasure to many others who have a fondness for the sea and ships. Their pleasure becomes their work, and their work is pleasure. The task of actually constructing a craft is highly technical, and the methods of the spirit world, so entirely different from those of the earth plane, have to be mastered. Although we must earn the right to possess in the spirit world, we have the aid of our friends in the actual building. We can form in our minds, when on earth, the shape of something we long to have, a garden, a home, or whatever it may be. It will then be a thought form, and will be converted from that into actual spirit substance by the help of experts. Our return was as delightful as our outward journey. When we drew into the land again, our host extended a permanent invitation to us to visit them on board whenever we wished, and enjoy with them all the recreation of sailing on the sea. As we walked along the sandy beach, Edwin recalled to our minds the great building in the center of the city, by telling us that very shortly there would be a visitation from a being of the higher realms, and for which many would be gathering in the domed temple. Would we care to join him? It was not in any sense to be considered a specific act of worship for which this personage was visiting the realm. Such things as worship do not require conscious effort. They come spontaneously from the heart. But our visitor would bring with him not only his own radiance, but the radiance of the heavenly sphere which he graced. We at once expressed our eagerness to go with him, as we both felt that we would not have ventured there alone, since we had all along been under Edwin's guidance. As we walked down the broad avenue of trees and gardens, we formed part of a great concourse of people who were all proceeding in the same direction, and obviously for the same purpose. Strange to say that although we were among so many people, yet we never experienced the feeling so common on earth of being amongst a large crowd. It was an extraordinary feeling which Ruth shared with me. We supposed that we had expected our old earthly sensations would have overcome us, the fear that in such an immense assemblage of people there would be something of the confusion that one is accustomed to on the earth plane, the jostling and the noise, and above all the sense of time passing, when our enjoyment would be over and past. To have such ideas as these was quite ridiculous, and Ruth and I laughed at ourselves, as did Edwin, for expressing such notions, on entertaining them for an instant. We felt, because we knew, that everything was in perfect order, that everyone knew what to do or where to go, that there was no question of another's superiority over ourselves for reasons of privilege. We felt that we were expected for the support we should give, and that a personal welcome was waiting for us. Was not this sufficient to banish all feelings of discomfort or uneasiness? There was, moreover, a unity of mind among us that is not possible on the earth plane, even with those of the same religious beliefs. What earthly religion is there where all its adherents are entirely of one mind? There is none. It has been thought essential on earth that to offer up thanks and worship to the Supreme Being, there must be a complexity of ritual and formularies and ceremonies, with creeds and dogmas and strange beliefs over which there is as much diversity of views as there are numbers of different religions. It may be said that I have already told of the establishment of communities of those same religions here in the spirit world, so that the spirit world is in no better case than the earth world. When the earth world becomes really enlightened, those communities here will disappear. It is the blindness and stupidity of the earth world that causes them to be here at all. They are given tolerance, and they must exercise tolerance themselves, otherwise they would be swept away. They must never attempt to influence or coerce any soul into believing any of their erroneous doctrines. They must confine themselves strictly to themselves, but they are perfectly and absolutely free to practice their own false religion among themselves. The truth awaits them on the threshold of their churches as they leave their places of worship, not when they have entered. When a soul at length perceives the futility of his particular and peculiar religious beliefs, he quickly disassociates himself from them, and in full freedom and complete truth, which has no creeds or ecclesiastical commandments, he offers up his thoughts to his heavenly Father just as they flow from his mind, free and unaffected, stripped of all jargon, simple and heartfelt. But we have our temples where we can receive the great messengers from the highest realms, fitting places to receive the Father's representatives, and where such messengers can send our united thanks and our petitions to the great source of all. We do not worship blindly as on earth. As we drew close to the temple, we could already feel ourselves being, as it were, charged with spiritual force. Edwin told us this was always the case because of the immense power brought by the higher visitors, which remained undiminished within a wide circle of the temple. It was for this reason that the temple stood completely isolated, with no other buildings near it. Gardens alone surrounded it, a great sea of flowers extending, it almost seemed, as far as the eye could see, and presenting such a galaxy of brilliant color in great banks and masses as the earth could never contemplate. And arising from all this were the most heavenly sounds of music and the most delicate perfumes, the effect upon us being that of pure exhalation of the Spirit. We felt that we were lifted up above ourselves right out into another realm. The building itself was magnificent. It was stately, it was grand, it was an inspiration in itself. It appeared to be made of the finest crystal, but it was not transparent. Massive pillars were polished until they shone like the sun, while every carving flashed its brilliant colors until the whole edifice was a temple of light. Never did I think such scintillations possible, for not only did the surfaces reflect the light in the ordinary way, they gave out a light of their own that could be felt spiritually. Edwin took us to some seats which we knew to be our own, we had that feeling of familiarity with them, as one does with a favorite chair at home. Above us was the great dome of exquisitely wrought gold, which reflected the hundreds of colors that shone from the rest of the building. But the focus of all attention was upon the marble statuary, which word I must use for want of a better, at the end of the temple. It had a shallow baldress with a central opening at the head of a flight of steps leading down to the floor. We could hear the sounds of music, but whence it came I knew not, because there was no sign of any musicians. The music was evidently provided by a large orchestra of strings only, for there were no sounds of the other instruments of the orchestra. The sanctuary, which was of spacious dimensions, was filled with many beings from higher realms, with the exception of a space in the center which I guessed was reserved for our visitor. We were all of us seated, and we conversed quietly among ourselves. Presently we were aware of the presence of a stately figure of a man with jet-black hair, who was closely followed, very much to my surprise, by the kindly Egyptian whom we had met in Edwin's house on the boundary of our realm. To those who had already witnessed such visitations, their arrival was at once the indication of the coming of the high personage, and we all accordingly rose to our feet. Then, before our eyes, there appeared first a light, which might almost be described as dazzling, but as we concentrated our gaze upon it, we immediately became attuned to it, and we felt no sensation of spiritual discomfort. In point of fact, as I discovered later, the light really became attuned to us, that is to say, it was toned down to accord with ourselves in our realm. The light really it grew to a shade to a golden hue upon the extremities, gradually brightening toward the center. And in the center there slowly took shape the form of our visitor. As it gained in density, we could see that he was a man whose appearance was that of youth, spiritual youth, but we knew that he carried with him an unimaginable degree to an unimaginable degree the three comprehensive and all-sufficing attributes of wisdom, knowledge, and purity. His countenance shone with transcendental beauty. His hair was of gold, while around his head was a lustrous diadem. His raiment was of the most gossamer-like quality, and it consisted of a pure white robe, bordered with a deep band of gold, while from his shoulders there hung a mantle of the richest cerulean blue, which was fastened upon his breast with a great pink pearl. His movements were majestic as he raised his arms and sent forth a blessing upon us all. We remained standing and silent while our thoughts ascended to him who sent us such a glorious being. We sent our thanks and we sent our petitions. For myself, I had one boon to ask, and I asked for it. It is not possible for me to convey to you one fraction of the exaltation of the spirit that I felt while in the presence, though distance, of this heavenly guest. But I do know that not for long could I have remained in that temple while he was there without undergoing the almost crushing consciousness that I was low, very, very low, upon the scale of spiritual evolution and progression. And yet, I knew that he was sending out to me, as to all of us, thoughts of encouragement, of good hope, of kindness, in the very highest degree, that made me feel that I must never, never despair of attaining to the highest spiritual realm, and that there was good and useful work ready for me to do in the service of man, and that in the doing thereof I would have the whole of the spiritual realms behind me, as they are behind every single soul who works in the service of man.